You surface from the underground at Piccadilly Circus.
Mind the gap.
Making your way through the glittering lights of London's West End, you take a turn down a quaint-looking street into the notorious neighborhood of Soho. The lights are up, the crowd is buzzing, and you just stepped into the best seat in the house. Welcome to The Big Smoke, a variety show podcast. I'm Kevin Bennett, and I'll be your guide through this experience of comedy, conversation, and community. This week on The Big Smoke, we're celebrating pride from every angle through folklore, resistance, and the unexpected treasures history leaves behind. First, I sit down with Sunday Times bestselling author Sacha Coward to talk about queer as folklore and how myths, monsters, and fairy tales have always carried our queer stories, whether we noticed it or not. Then, for our Parish Notices, we zoom out to look at the state of LGBTQ+ rights around the world today, before I share a piece of my own journey and the true story of Matthew Shepard that stayed with me since I was a teenager. And finally, fan favorite Sean Clark the Mudlark is back with his latest find, a tiny copper ghost of a queer king washing ashore at just the right moment. So, let's dive into queer folklore. Please welcome Sacha Coward. Hello, welcome to The Big Smoke. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So we're here talking today about this fantastic book that you've written, your first book, yes?
Yeah.
Queer as Folklore, the hidden queer history of myths and monsters. Also, in researching you, I have found out that you work in the museum sector, you do or have done tours in cemeteries, you've built escape rooms, so it's quite an eclectic mix of things. So I'd love to just start by asking, how does one build a life with such a interesting mix of, you're not just someone who works in a museum or someone who's written a book about folklore and history. There's quite a kind of eclectic mix in that. So was that always part of your life, or did you grow up in an eclectic household? Where did that come from?
Well, in my self-effacing moments, I would describe myself as like basically a symptom of a deeply wrong society. I mean, I'm the Veruca on the underside of late-stage capitalism. Like, why is there a queer historian escape room designer? That sounds like a joke, right? In Portlandia or something.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, like, I mean, I've always loved stories. So as a little boy, I would sneak downstairs when my parents had adult friends in and would list every single Greek god that I could think of, because I was that precocious, annoying child. And like monsters and myths and legends were always something that I just deeply loved. And then on top of that, I love games. I love playing games. I like building games. And so that's kind of where I am at, this kind of weird, playful, queer history thing. I'd say like I was in a much more traditional museum worker role. So up until about 6 years ago, I was working at the National Maritime Museum in education. So kind of, whether it was Nelson or Pirates or the Titanic, whatever, doing workshops, coming up with ideas for different community groups. And then went freelance when I was like, can I just do the bits that I love and not the stuff that I don't love? And the stuff I love is queer history, folklore and mythology, and building games. And so that's so far what I do. It shouldn't be a career. It's a very weird career. But at the moment, it's working, and I am able to survive and buy Waitrose sandwiches every now and then. So clearly I'm doing okay.
Hey, that's not bad.
Right.
Which one came first? Was it, you said you came downstairs and you were naming all the Greek myths you could name. Was that the origin of it? Was there like a book in the house of Greek myths, do you think? Or was it the sort of gaming side of things?
The Orchard Book of Greek Myths. It had a pink cover, and I actually brought it up in a bookshop talk recently, and there was someone who went, yeah, like they had the same book. I can visualize it. It didn't have like the really racy queer stuff in it, but it had a lot of like tragic stories, and like particularly I remember loving the story of Narcissus and Echo, because it's like these two characters, both of which have a fatal flaw. Narcissus is in love with himself, Echo never stops talking and is in love with Narcissus, and it's so sad, and she ends up becoming like wasting away and becoming the echo of her own voice, and he turns into the flower gazing at his own reflection. And I think those sad stories, if we're going to get a bit real and a bit like tragic queer, before I knew I was different or like fully understood how I was not like the other boys, I knew that there was something. Like I think even at the age of 7, maybe I couldn't have articulated it, but there was something going on where I knew that there were those boys and then there was me. And so when I would look at a love story that had like a happy ending and a wedding at the end, it didn't make sense. Like that didn't fit. But those myths where everyone gets turned into monsters or flowers, and there's like a sense of tragic from the start, something innately inside them will end, awfully for everybody. My little 7-year-old self saw something in that. So there's a sweetness there and there's a sadness. Like, isn't it sad that I think a lot of queer folk love a tragedy because there's something tragic about being queer today. So yeah, I think that's where it started, that love of stories. And then, loving stories meant that, I loved games because video games and all that, it's basically a story. A lot of it is you're just playing the main character. And then, just kind of, I didn't know I really liked history until, if you'd asked me at GCSE history, I hated it because it was all just dates.
I'm the same. It's interesting with history because in another part of my life, I work in theater and mostly as a director of historical plays. And I never would have guessed that I would have gone into that because history, I felt the same thing. It was sort of dates and wars. Here's this war, here's this date, here's this battle, here's this, leader. I was going to ask though, did you grow up in a household where it was these types of things were talked about in terms of like, I don't know, I just think it's really interesting because so much of your life, whether it's in the museum space or in the doing tours or in the writing of the books, is obviously around queer culture and mythology and the topics of the book we're about to get into. So I'm curious because some people kind of hide in stories. I mean, I think I kind of became an actor and a director as a sort of way of living in someone else's story. It was like a safety in that. And I wasn't particularly interested in queer or gay stories. In fact, I kind of shunned them. I remember in drama school, there was a theater company that was sort of burgeoning a few years sort of ahead of me, a young theater company, and they were queer focused. They were telling these stories. And I remember thinking, that is not what I want to do for whatever reason. So I'm curious how you came to that. Did it feel like an easy thing? Did it feel like a really difficult thing that you had to come to, or
I mean, so my mum's an artist. She's a painter, like very, very sort of feminist, political painter, not like watercolors, right? Really aggressive, thought-provoking stuff. And my dad was an accountant, but like a really sweet, sensitive guy. They were both like one step away from hippies. And I think, they didn't raise me with queer history and queer stories, but my mum knew a lot of artists and a lot of them were queer. And so conversations around like her cross-dressing ex-boyfriend and the existence of trans people, I think I knew from listening into them for a while. So that was there in the background. Bizarrely, they were both very surprised when I came out, which I was always like, that's really strange. And it's weird what you said. That does resonate. I still think on a certain level, I've written a book about queer history and I still have this slight aversion when it's like, oh, you should watch this thing on Netflix. It's about gay people. And I'm like, I don't want to watch it. I don't know whether it's internalized homophobia or that kind of thing where, maybe it is like the love of stories came first and it was any story. And then I've had to kind of work a little bit on my relationship with my queer identity in that, because when I first went and started working in museums, I just wanted to work in museums. I wanted to be around old stuff and cool stuff. It's where the stories were, all the stories.
So you didn't go in with an agenda per se of I want to tell these stories or I want to tell them in a different way necessarily.
I didn't know that there were those stories to tell in my early 20s. I mean, I just wanted to work at a museum because I thought museums were cool. And I think it was when I was there, for a while, I think I even actively avoided that because I didn't want to become the gay dude that does the gay stuff. And then I think that the kind of realization came when there wasn't any gay stuff happening. And I kept, I'd sit there in silent in a meeting, lovely people that I work with, really cool people. And then finally I'd put my hand up and go, so are we going to talk about this part of the story, which clearly no one's mentioning? And everyone would go, oh, yes, of course. Sacha, do you want to lead on that? slowly I realized that if I wasn't going to advocate for it, if there wasn't another queer person in the room, then it wouldn't get advocated for. And then I guess I've slowly come to the phase where I actually just like queer history, not just because I'm queer and I think it's important and I think it's valuable. It's also because they're the story of weird underdogs, and those are the best stories. Irrespective of the fact that clearly I've come to it because I have a personal connection, a political connection, a belief that these are important, but just because they're really fun and I think more people should hear about them because they're cool.
So I came across your book, and there's sort of two things that drew me really to it. One is, for me growing up, in the 90s, Friends, those types of shows were very common. And a lot of what I took in was the classic 90s kind of homophobic, jokes about Chandler being gay, all of these different things. There wasn't, from my memory, a lot of content that I was taking in that was really telling my story or telling any kind of queer stories. And then the other side of it is I love the history and the origin of stories and ideas. I think it comes from my work in theater, and I'm just fascinated with digging into kind of these ancient stories. And so obviously I picked it up, thought it's really, really fascinating. In the beginning of the book, I thought it would be useful for people who are listening to do what you do briefly in the intro, which is you define a few terms. So the book is called Queer as Folklore. So obviously there's two terms in there that I'd love for you to define, which is queer and folklore. And then I'm thinking maybe myth as well, the difference between folklore and myth. Do you want to start with those three?
Yeah, sure. So queer as folklore, firstly, it comes from an old English phrase which may have migrated around the world, but it's most famous in the UK, particularly in the north of England, which is queer as folk. And the phrase is there's nowt as queer as folk, which means there's no one as weird as everyday people. So it's a phrase that an old woman or old man would say, like, there's nowt as queer as folk, which means aren't people strange? Like, people just do the weirdest things, don't they? And it's actually it's quite a sweet phrase. Now, today, obviously, the word queer has this other meaning, which is, it's queer started out as a slur, although arguably it was reclaimed very, very early. We've got records from the 1930s of gay and bisexual people referring to themselves as queer. Queer means different or odd. It comes from the Latin word torquere, which means to twist or contort. So it's like strange, different, twisted. So there's obviously a dark side to that, right? But at the same time, in the original phrase, queer as folk, it's like, aren't they funny? It's not hateful. It's like, aren't people odd? Now, it also comes from, Russell T Davies in the, I think it was the early 2000s, created the TV show Queer as Folk, which was also adapted into an American show. And that was so already taking that popular phrase, taking the queer and putting a joke on it and exploring the lives of a bunch of generally gay people. There are a few lesbians chucked in for flavour, but mostly gay people in and around Manchester. And so it has this kind of added meaning. So that's why I went for the title, because it has these layers that I quite like. But in terms of how I'm using it, so the word folklore, it sounds kind of heavy and maybe a bit academic, but if you just break it down into the two parts of that word, folk and lore, folk just means people. Right? Hey, folk. And lore means stories. So folklore is the study of the stories that people tell. That's all it means. It doesn't mean anything more than that. So the book is basically saying stories that people tell, all of these, and we'll get into what myths and legends mean, but myths, legends, fairy tales, anecdotes, gossip, the things that we create. Not necessarily the news and the facts, but all the stories and the creatures and the mystical and magical stuff around it. I am arguing in this book has this really deep queer connection that maybe isn't always unpacked fully. And I think it's really interesting to see what happens when you do that. Now, you can go really into it. So folklore, if you go to a university, people might debate what is and isn't folklore. So is folklore just oral history? So if you tell a story like with your mouth to someone else, I know that sounds
I usually use my mouth, but
use your mouth to tell
always.
that story. Yeah, I mean, but is it written down is the thing. So as soon as you write it down, some people might argue now it's not folklore anymore because it's not oral, it's now written down. But I'm just using folklore literally just to mean stories. As simple as that. But there are differences. So like a myth might be a story that you use to explain something. So where does the sun come from? Why do people fall in love? Why, who was the very first narcissist? Why is there a flower called a hyacinth? Things like that are myths. They explain why. There's always a why in there. And a legend is a bit of folklore, which is kind of a pseudo bit of history. It's like fake history. So, Arthur and the Round Table and the Knights of Arthur, that's a legend. There probably wasn't an Arthur who was actually King Arthur, and he didn't probably have a magical sword.
Right.
But it's a story we all know, and it even has a time period, and it has like its own timeline. And for a long time, some people may have believed it was true. So that's what we might call a legend. So the book is just like, let's look at stories through the lens of myths and monsters. That's how the chapters are divided up. And let's look at the way that they tie to experiences that today we'd call gay, lesbian, transgender, intersex, asexual, you name it.
There's one other term that I think would be useful because I feel like I know what it means, but then it's one of those ones where I maybe didn't know or I didn't quite know, and I think it'd be useful for people to know, which is coding or queer coding.
The way that we would talk about coding is when something isn't overt. So let's use a good example. People often talk about queer-coded Disney villains.
Okay.
So if you've ever watched a Disney film, let's talk about Lion King, right? So if you imagine Lion King and you imagine Scar, so Scar is the antagonist, right? At no point in the film does anyone go, oh yes, Scar, the homosexual lion, right? And Scar doesn't go, I really fancy men and I came out when I was 15. Of course, like that's not part of the story.
There is the director's cut, the backstory.
There is I'd love to see the director's cut. But like, if you watch Scar, the way he's performed, the way he's written, like, for example, there's this line that I think most gay men will really chuckle at when they watch it again, which is where Simba, who is, Scar's nephew, says like, oh my God, you're so weird, uncle. And Scar responds, you have no idea.
Yeah.
And,
I can picture that.
Right? If you have like a nephew or a niece and you've had that interaction where you are the weird gay uncle, like he's written to be camp, he's feminine, he's dramatic, he minces around, the way he moves his shoulders, the way that he speaks.
That song.
Yeah, that be prepared. Right.
So good.
It's over the top.
Yeah.
It's campy. Compare that to Mufasa, who is, this is a weird thing to say, but he's kind of a hunky lion. He's like
kind of stoic, like kind of
serious.
still, and
Simba, everything the light touches,
Yeah.
right? I swear I've not watched this film in a long time. It's left
let's just
such a
do the
mark.
one-person version of the Lion King.
Exactly.
We're not
That's
far
what-
from the West End
Forget
Theater.
talk about queer folklore. We're just going to do the Lion
The Lion
King.
King isn't in the book,
Or
but
is
let's
it
just go.
the Lion Queen.
Well, could be. So with queer coding, like for example with Scar, I was about to say Jafar. I feel like maybe that's another
No,
one.
but yeah, exactly the same. And name them. Maleficent. Yes.
Yeah.
Go through
So
them.
with these, is the concept of queer coding meaning that the people who wrote them knew that, or they didn't, or sometimes it's one, sometimes it's the other?
Yeah, it can be either. So the coding, the reason we call it code, it's like a code. It's secret. It's hidden. It's underneath.
Right.
It's not necessarily overt. So this can happen in many ways. The animators, the writers might have gone in the back of their head, I kind of want this character to be like, a bit fruity. Maybe that's going to be a bit of a flavor that we're going to give this character. A bit butch if they're female, a bit dramatic, Maybe I'm going to like draw upon my gay uncle or this one person I saw and knew from theatre camp or whatever. Or maybe it is unconscious and it's this idea of, well, what does a villain look like? Well, they're dramatic, right? They have a cape. And our main character is like, he gets the girl, he's kind of masculine and he goes through this journey of self-discovery, which makes him more strong, more alpha. So his foil, his opposite, has got to be this slightly simpering, weird, let's make this character stand out. So the coding, the idea is, it is based on the idea of homosexuality or queerness is coded into the way we do certain things, not just Disney villains, but Count Dracula, right? Campus tits. All of these kind of these creatures that we code, you don't need to say explicitly this character is gay. anyone that's queer that watches it goes, yeah, you're talking about us, right?
There's something that you recognize. So speaking of Disney and queer coding, actually, I think this brings on to a really good first topic that's in the book that I'd love to talk about, which is mermaids. Can you tell us a little bit about the history of mermaids as, I guess, mythical creatures and how that evolved to some of the more modern interpretations today?
Yeah, so mermaids are one of my faves. They are perhaps my gateway drug to folklore. So I mentioned I used to work at the National Maritime Museum, which is one of the few places where if you say that you've been seeing mermaids all day, people don't think you're taking illicit substances. But yeah, I loved the Little Mermaid. To be honest, I liked Ursula. We won't get into that too much right now, but yeah, that was my favorite character from Disney. So mermaids have been created and recreated over and again throughout history. So you can't really think of a group of people, any civilization, any nationality that has looked at a body of water, doesn't need to be the sea, it could be a river or a pond, and created something that is like fish woman of some variety, something a bit flavored like that. They may have a different name for it. That's not because there's like some big Jungian collective unconsciousness. It's just because humans tend to do certain things. We have certain similarities. We look at water and go, what if fish lady, right? That's just basically something we seem to do.
There's a mystery there. There's a fear there, I guess,
Yeah.
an uncontrollable nature of the ocean.
Drowning in
different
water
things.
is scary.
Yeah.
What if it wasn't an accident? What if person lived in there? What would they look like? What would their motivations be? So the mermaid, in the way that when I say it, you're probably picturing in your head, it's kind of Little Mermaid, Starbucks. You know, we've been creating these creatures for a very long time, but you know, the ancient Greeks, the Romans had mermaid-like beings. They may have called them different things, naiads, nereids, sirens. You know, there's a whole thing about how that formed. But yeah, these creatures and beings are just like, they're a folkloric kind of category of creature in a way, and they subsume a lot of things. But what I've kind of argued is in a lot of their applications, they rub up very, very close to people that we would consider to be queer, and this is even in the ancient past. So Sappho of Lesbos, who's a poet who was associated with the island of Lesbos, she's where we get the name lesbian from, was associated with mermaids after her death. The Syrian goddess Atalgatis is like kind of a mermaid adjacent goddess, and her priestesses would self-castrate and ostensibly live as women, right? And we're talking thousands of years ago. All the way through Hans Christian Andersen, who wrote The Little Mermaid, and he was bisexual, and he wrote it after basically being rejected by a man. The Disney film, co-written by Howard Ashman. I mean, again, like you said, we could be here forever. What I'm trying to say is it's really, for me, it goes beyond coincidence that these important moments where mermaids get codified, so they get written down, they get put into fairy tales, into films, into songs, into sea shanties. Queer people seem to be tied to that. And my question is two things. What does that mean? Like, that's interesting. What does it mean for us today? And why? So why do we think that is? And I think that gets to the very core of all of the creatures I talk about in this book. Why are people like us so closely associated with both consuming and creating these kinds of mythical creatures?
Well, that was one of the things I found really moving, actually, in the whole book. And one of the most significant ones is the mermaid chapter, because you talk about Hans Christian Andersen as well as Howard Ashman in terms of two different creators of two different versions of the Little Mermaid or a mermaid story. And I was really interested because I didn't expect, I guess, when I started reading the book that there was going to be a real significance to the people who created the story, these stories, which of course is, I guess, obvious to me now that I've read it. But can you tell us a little bit about maybe the Howard Ashman story? I encourage people to read obviously all of it, because the Hans Christian Andersen story is quite tragic and really moving.
Yeah.
But let's maybe look at a little taste of the Howard Ashman story and how that connects and is significant to the mermaid story.
So Howard Ashman was, he was working in musical theatre and wrote some really beautiful songs, worked on a number of different plays and productions we won't go into, but was asked by Disney to be basically, at this point, Disney was really suffering.
When is this, in the 80s?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Little Mermaid came out in 1989.
Okay.
So it probably would have started kind of mid to late 80s.
Yeah.
And, after Snow White, Disney had really hit a fall. They just were not getting the hits like they were. And, The Little Mermaid was a huge, basically it brought Disney back to life. It resuscitated them, and it brought them into what we call the golden age of Disney. Aladdin, Beauty and the Beast, Lion King, all of these. And The Little Mermaid was picked because it's a well-known fairy tale, and it was adapted not just by Howard, but Alan Menken was working on it as well. But Howard brought his experience of musical theatre and as a queer person living in the 80s into the film. So when you watched the film as a kid, you probably picked up on it's got catchy songs, it's really colourful and vibrant, it's dramatic, Ursula's kind of scary, and then at the end there's a happy ending. But if you watch it today with this in mind of who Howard was and what he was adapting, listen to I want part of your world. I want to be with where the people are. I want to see them dancing. Now picture this being written whilst Howard is also writing Sheridan Square, which is a song about how all his friends are dying of HIV.
On Sheridan Square, Johnny and Steve and Martin, and the list that goes on too long. Dennis and Bill and Barry, you're the reasons I wrote this song.
So now see, what mindset are you in when you say, I want to be part of that world? I want to be where people are dancing, right? Maybe there's an added layer of longing going on there. And he voiced all the songs before they were cast. So you can hear original productions of him singing these songs, and they take on a different meaning.
I want to be where the people are. I want to see them dancing.
And, also elements like Ursula that we mentioned, Disney were originally going to make her a wizened old crone because she's a sea witch. But instead, Howard drew upon the inspiration of Divine, who was a drag queen from the 1970s. And so she becomes this full-bodied wench, right? She has this different physical presence. You meet her putting makeup on in a mirror. It's a drag performance, is what you're saying. She uses body language.
Oh, that body language. And also, I recommend for people listening, have a quick Google of Divine, because I hadn't seen any images of the actual drag queen, and it's uncanny.
Yeah.
There is no denying that Ursula is based on that person.
This isn't gossip. This is a fact. The animators had
obviously Ursula. It's wild.
The animators had an image of Divine on one side, and they were creating their version of Ursula on the other. And so, the entire film is littered with all of these little references and riffs where, let's put it this way. Howard Ashman didn't go, right, Disney's given me this film, I'm going to queer the hell out of it. I'm going to use my queer theory, and I'm going to put all of these subtextual... That's not how anyone makes anything. But what you do is you draw from your own experience. You go, okay, if I was a mermaid who loved someone that was forbidden and I wanted to escape, what kind of song would I write? And how would I feel if I had to sacrifice everything to be happy and go against my father? And so you think of it that way. How are you going to draw from your own emotional lexicon, from your own experiences? So then you watch the film now and you go, oh, okay, it's still a Disney film. It's for kids. It's not like it was secretly created to have some queer agenda. It's just that because it was made by someone like Howard, it contains this other layer of information that's really fascinating. So, for example, at the end of the film, when Eric and Ariel
is Eric the prince's name?
Eric's
I don't even remember.
The prince's name. Yeah. And Ariel's only gets the name in the film. In the original book, she's just called the Little Mermaid. She doesn't have a name. And they walk off into the sea and they get married, right? And Triton raises his trident. So Hunky Dad, who's been rejecting this relationship the whole time, and makes a huge rainbow that appears above them. Now, rainbows are cute and lovely, and families love them, right? So it's not like it's inappropriate or it was subversive queer context. But why a rainbow?
Yeah.
He's a god of the sea.
Yeah.
It's a weird thing to do, unless, we know that Gilbert Baker created the rainbow flag in 1979. So the rainbow flag was a symbol that Howard would have known. And so what is created over this odd creature, half-formed being and the boy that she loves once they get together by the once disapproving father. I think there's something there. And you can fight me on that one. That's fine.
So you were saying that this was kind of your gateway, and Ursula specifically spoke to you, you mentioned in the book. How did that come about, or was it just a character that you really liked and then later you discovered this link? Or do you think there's almost a reversal in that? There's something about the way that the character was portrayed that drew you in that you then later discovered?
Well, that's like, you got to be careful to not like over intellectualize your childhood interests. But so on one level, I liked her because she looked different. She looked scary. She had tentacles, which was cool. And like her song was catchy, But here's the thing I believe resonated with me. So I was, maybe this will resonate with some of your listeners who are queer or not queer for that matter. I was, nerdy, skinny boy, 2 left feet, couldn't play sports, really unathletic. The only thing that I had was I could be quite good with words. I could be, we might use the word sassy, but I hate that word. But like, I could tell a joke sometimes. Sure. I was always good at observing and watching. Whereas like, Ariel's going like, what's that word? And like stumbling over her words. Ursula has this way with words, right? And like whispering to one side, flotsam jetsam, I think I've got her, boys, the boss is on a roll, like, and there's these layers of song going on. So she's singing to Ariel whilst tricking her, whilst giving away her evil plan, but then not enough, and sort of, kind of manipulating and using all, and so she's waging a war with words, and it was clever and fast and layered. And so I was watching this interesting, vivacious character, and I guess I didn't see myself as being like I was going to be the nice, normal, hot protagonist that gets the boy in the end, but I could wage a war with words. I can play with things. I can do that. So there was something enticing about that kind of character.
In the book, Sacha writes, "The story of mermaids might be make-believe, but it is also the very real story of thousands of years of queer people understanding themselves through a hybrid being of beauty and danger." Okay, in this book, mermaids is our kind of way in. You talk about so many different characters and stories, from fairies to vampires. There's some fantastic stuff in there. I want to skip ahead to, you talk about something that you do, which is cemetery tours. And the reason I bring it up is because, we read the book and we talk about mermaids and vampires and these kind of made up creatures and characters. So why did you want to include a chapter about real people and their history and your experience leading tours in cemeteries?
So with the cemetery tours, firstly, I have to honor my friend Sheldon Goodman, who runs Cemetery Club. So I've known him for years now. We're good friends. And he invited me to run a tour with him of Tower Hamlets Cemetery in London. And from then on, we've now gone and done other projects, which we call like Queerly Departed. So we've done projects with Brompton Cemetery and some in Bristol. So that the tours themselves are fascinating because you get to talk about incredible stories. You walk past headstones, you have no idea who's buried there, right? They all look roughly the same. So that's really lovely. Why it's in the book, it's in a chapter which is also called Queerly Departed, because it's more exploring the idea. So we do fairies and mermaids, but what about like ghosts and symbols related to death? Because in folklore, there is a lot of symbology in creatures and beings and ideas that relate to mortality. The Grim Reaper, the Spectre, the Wraith, right? So these concepts. So what I wanted to look at was, and this is going to sound really pretentious, but the way that queer people historically have explored death or been related to death, in their poetry, the idea being that coming out of the closet, risking your life for love, transitioning, all these things can feel like death or rebirth, or, it's going from one side to another. And historically, like if we look at the 19th century, queer people are massively overrepresented as spiritualists, people that were supposed to be able to speak to the dead or would commune with ghosts. And so that for me is a really interesting thing. Like, what is it about that idea of like liminal spaces in between life and death that, again, I find queer people overrepresented in? And so Why is it when I take cemetery tours, me and Sheldon will find that we have loads of queer people that want to walk around a cemetery? Like, what's that about? Why do we joke that Halloween is, gay Christmas? What's that about? There is a darkness that we like to play with, a gothic kind of edge to what we like to do. Drag queens, you'll either see them stereotypically beautiful blonde bombshells or like the most terrifying Tim Burton creation you can imagine, right? There's the two extremes. So I think, that chapter was about looking about how queer people are connected to death and the stories around that. To speak really frankly, historically, queer people, particularly gay and bisexual men, have had to find spaces where they could have relationships away from prying eyes. And one of those spaces was cemeteries. Historically, Brompton Cemetery in London was a place where so-called pretty policemen, who would be policemen out of uniform, would go try to basically ensnare gay men by soliciting them and then arresting them. Because these green spaces that were public but not a park where everyone lies around. So a little bit more quiet, a little bit more private. And that may seem wildly inappropriate, having sex amongst the headstones. But that's the whole thing I'm getting at. There is something historically around queerness that has brought us into these weird spaces where we're often quite close to death. And I wanted to unpack that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I was just thinking when you were talking about that, about my own experience. I mean, everybody has a different experience from the sort of before and after in terms of coming out. And I do think, I mean, you can read really, so you can sort of psychologize yourself into this, which is something I've done many times. But, it's a death in a way. And it's also like nothing will ever be the same. There's a massive shift from that point. But also, I think it's also the beginning of a life of that in a way, like a constant kind of recycling of how you do that. In the book, Sacha writes, humans tend to not like the strange sensation of being in between or inhabiting the unknown. But for queer people who so often live a life in a kind of underworld anyway, this can feel almost natural. For queer writers and artists, cruising is like haunting. Transitioning is being reincarnated, and loving someone you shouldn't can feel bittersweet, like a kind of death. Now, you also talk about aliens, which is really interesting. And specifically, there's so much of it that I love, but there's a bit where you talk about fan fiction, or what was it called? Slash fiction to do with Star Trek. And I was curious if you could tell us a little bit about that, specifically the significance of Diane Marchant and why she's in the book, but also just why fan fiction is in the book. Because I think someone could look and go, well, Star Trek, there's no queer stories in that. So why is that something that you're leading us to? Aliens, Star Trek, fan fiction.
Okay. So let's start with the alien thing, because I think people might be surprised to find that in a book on folklore, because you hear folklore, you think old.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. History, old.
Yeah. Dusty old fairy tale books, Brothers Grimm, that's where your brain goes. Now, firstly, alien stories are really, really old. So, and I'm not getting into like tinfoil hats, ancient aliens here. I'm just saying that, we've been talking about creatures from other worlds since the ancient Greeks and before, right? So these stories, the way they look today, are very modern because we tie them into modern technology.
Yes.
But the actual idea of that is very, very old.
That is true. Just a side point. I do only think of aliens from the perspective of them coming here almost, which means they must be further advanced, and there's a futuristic technological kind of thing to it. So yeah, that's really interesting.
It's just the way that we tell those stories. And some would say that the alien story is just like a subset of the fairy or the changeling story. So a creature comes from another world and it replaces you, or it changes you, or it transforms you, it whisks you away, and then something weird happens.
Are the aliens among us? That question that people sort of... Have they already landed? All that kind of stuff.
It's been explored a lot. Like, TV shows like Stargate and even like the Marvel universe have explored the idea, what if aliens were actually gods or blah or blah? So yeah, it's ripe for folklore analysis. Now, getting into so why I discuss it in terms of Star Trek. So for those that weren't hyper online from like the late 90s onwards, well done for escaping that trap. But I was, and one of the fascinating kind of worlds that it's actually much more impactful than you might think. But the idea of fan fiction, so people, loving something and creating their own stories around it. And that's been happening for a long time. So arguably there is biblical fan fiction that happened in the 19th century. It definitely happened around Sherlock Holmes. So people wrote their own versions of the stories. And the most famous, though, that basically kicked off what we would call almost the modern fan identity. Like nowadays, everything from Team Edward to, Harry Potter fans to that whole, like all of the people who get really angry when someone is cast in for a new Marvel film, that whole concept, more or less, one could argue, started with Star Trek.
Space, the final frontier.
Like the fan base there, the way that they produced their own magazines, their own culture, their own conventions, it established what, there was no Comic-Con before that. There was not in the way. There was no cosplay in the same fashion. And those people writing stories, the stories they wrote were largely queer. They were largely about same-sex relationships between the characters in Star Trek that did not happen canonically. So what I'm finding fascinating is when people were creating, like, arguably the most famous science fiction alien franchise in the world, what were the fan base into? They were into basically gaying up the characters.
Right.
Why? Why was that what they did? You could write any number of fan fiction spin-offs. Why this slash fiction? The slash fiction refers specifically to same-sex kind of relationships. Now, if you're not a nerd and really online and weird, this probably sounds very strange and you're like, what is this guy on about? But let's just put it this way. In like 2005, if you searched Harry Potter fan fiction, 98% of it was Harry and Draco Malfoy getting it off together in the woods. That's what teenagers were writing. That was their spin-off. You pick any big popular franchise, Doctor Who, Sherlock, Supernatural, any of the big TV series, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, the majority of people creating their own stories, really, were creating gay or queer fan fiction. And I think that's a really interesting thing. What is it about? You could argue that these people are creating their own folklore. They're creating their own spin-offs. They've seen something and they're doing their own thing with it and they're sharing it. Why is it largely, arguably, either queer people or even cis-het people creating queer stories? Like, what is that desire? And I find that that's really interesting. And so modern science fiction, modern aliens are really built. A lot of that is built on queer fan bases, subversion of sexuality and gender, hugely. And so nowadays we end up in this space where when you make an alien film, you're basing it on all of these people, like Diana Marchment, who wrote one of the most famous Star Trek kind of fan fictions. That had more impact than you would imagine in terms of how we create science fiction worlds today. So I would argue there's now like a bit of queerness. It's just loaded in there because of the impact of people that were into sharing and recreating those stories.
Is there significance that you spoke about Diane Merchant, like you mentioned in the book that she knew the creator of Star Trek or one of the creators? Is there I guess, is there a stronger kind of case for it because of that? Or is that a happy coincidence kind of thing, or what do you think?
The reason I mention hers is because it's famous. Like, it's really, it was very popular. Like, it was really popular. Other than the Star Trek TV show itself, it was possibly the most read and the most popular kind of fan fiction spin-off. She also did get to know Gene Roddenberry, who created Star Trek. And so what's interesting there is what she says about why she did that. Because Roddenberry created Star Trek as quite a utopian world. He had this idea. Now, obviously, it wasn't fully successful. What would a world look like without racism, without sexism, post-capitalist, where we all come together for the best, where we don't care care about what you look like or what race or alien species you are. We're all the same, we're all equal, and we all just try to kind of push forward. That was his vision. You know, he was really keen on that. And so Diane was very much kind of saying, well, in this world, well, obviously, like, same-sex desire would be, like, fine, right? And these two men, this is in keeping with what Roddenberry would have wanted. So, yeah, she wasn't just creating her own, like, oh, wouldn't it be sexy if this and this? But also she was responding to something she saw in Roddenberry's vision. And I guess you could say a lot of science fiction is either, like, utopian or dystopian, right? All the popular science fiction is. It's either what if amazing world or what if terrible world. And somehow that has some really interesting implications on sexuality and gender and how we depict that.
In the book, Sacha writes, "At best, the alien is a safe space for people to explore their identities. At worst, it takes all the greatest concerns around LGBTQ plus people and turns them into a brand new monster to be feared, hated, and even hunted. Yet there is a power in reclaiming these modern monstrosities, even the most strange and inhuman iterations." So we're sort of similar age, and I think, like, you know, quarter of a century ago, believe it or not, is when we were taking in some of these Disney films and stories and folklore. How can we use this understanding and this book and other stories and books like it that are directing us in this way, or opening up the lid on things that we maybe didn't see before, for someone who's younger now, who's taking it in? Because, you know, maybe it's slightly too complex to give to a 10-year-old, but, you know, like, for someone who is taking in Little Mermaid for the first time or whatever, you know, of that age. Because I just think to myself, I grew up at a time where I probably saw these things in stories, but then when I was getting a little bit older, I started to see a lot of negative connotations towards queerness in all of its forms. So what can we do with this, I guess, in a way?
I think, like, maybe there's two big takeaways, I hope. And, you know, like, my book's just one book. There's loads of fascinating queer history exploring this. And in some senses, my book's just a literature survey of other people's work and research. But one is, like, it's good to understand that, so all the things we love in art and culture, the fairy tales, the films, the music, the gorgeous stuff, the wonderful stuff, the frightening stuff, right, is created off the back of the sheer breadth of human experience. And I think there is a, you know, particularly today, but it's been happening for a long time, this pushback to say, and it's not just about queer people, that it's only certain kinds of people that create stuff that is worthwhile, that the world that you live in, that the things you love and enjoy about that world were created for you kindly, stereotypically, by cisgender white men, and they built it for you. You're welcome. And I guess it's about saying those people built some cool stuff too, but it takes all sorts. And, you know, if you can get from this book the idea that The Little Mermaid would not exist if it wasn't for queer people, and not just one queer person, but, you know, generations and generations, arguably thousands of years of this different way of living and loving, then you can kind of see the way that different kinds of people contribute to society. Almost going back to Gene Roddenberry's vision of Star Trek. I want to live in a world where we appreciate, like, wow, difference creates so much variety. It creates the things that you love. You don't need to be gay to love The Little Mermaid. Obviously not. Most people that love The Little Mermaid aren't. But those different experiences give us new interpretations, which create some of the most powerful moments in culture, which is beautiful, right? And I want to kind of, we're getting to this space where when a gay character or a black character or woman is included in a storyline, to be honest, it can be very cynical. I would agree sometimes there is something worth saying, oh, I don't think the company's thought about this. But often there is just a backlash simply because of their presence. And the argument is that they don't belong here. And I want to get to a space where we go, like, the world we live in exists because of everyone and for everyone. Sorry, that's very like utopia, but that's kind of one of the big takeaways.
Yeah, I also think what is kind of beautiful and what I would hope that people could kind of see is if you look at something like The Little Mermaid, you could look at the surface and think there's a version of a girl who wants her prince. But actually, if you look kind of deeper, or if you look from a different angle, you can look at someone who doesn't belong to, feels like she doesn't belong to another world that she wants to be a part of, feels like there's no way for her to be a part of the world, be with that person. So there's a, I guess, deeper metaphor to it. And so allowing ourselves to see the maybe inner workings of some of these stories more than just the on the surface, Cinderella wants the prince, or you know, that type of stuff, that there are deeper things being said inside it, which is what I loved about this, because there was lots of things that I didn't know. You know, we won't get into it today, but there's your whole chapter about vampires. And I sort of actually thought it was more about, or only about, the sort of vampire myth, female desire and sexuality in a way. And seeing some of the other angles to it was really eye-opening.
Yeah. Nobody owns a symbol. Right.
Yeah.
So Mermaid can tell, you know, that story can tell you a million different things. I think the last thing I would say as a take home, though, is the negative side, but the important side is what we can learn about how queer people have been associated with monsters in the past can also teach us a lot about what's going on today. Like, listen to the language. So when you hear a headline, you know, from a conservative or a Republican talking point that says something like trans people are demonic, or this is a satanic attack on this, or who is this creature, or just listen to it and you can go, right, this is dangerous. Like, this is dehumanizing. This is the language of the witch hunts. This is the language of the satanic panic. And historically, when we have been othered this way and turned into creatures or turned into monsters, we need to be really careful. We need to not just reclaim that, but we need to have an understanding of our history, of how this has happened before. This is a cyclical thing, to arm ourselves a little bit as you know, against this wave of dehumanization. Folklore can be so beautiful and empowering for queer people. We find our Ursula, we find our Scar, but it also creates images in your head. You know, if you're not queer and your only interaction of camp people is that they're the villain in Disney, you go out into the real world, you presume that all queer people or camp people you meet are predatory, weird, and vindictive. You may not mean to have that idea, but it's there. So I think it is just about being, arming people, getting people to be really wise with how they, you know, interpret the world and the media that they're consuming based on thousands of years of history.
You end the book with probably my favorite chapter, which is called The 5 Magic Beans, which I think is just a really beautiful, kind of optimistic way to look at folklore. Can you just tell us why, or I guess what that is, and why you chose to end the book with that chapter?
So I spent the whole book being like, queer people are really connected to these mythical creatures. We've helped create them. We've resonated with them. We're written into them in all these different ways. Here are the examples. I wanted to end in a way that was like, okay, here is a way to understand why, rather than just like, that's just how it is. You know, I want to say like, why is that then? If I'm positing this grand thing that Little Mermaid is actually, you know, a same-sex love story and all of this stuff, like, okay, cool, nice, but why? And so I wanted to give like 5 reasons why, you know, historically, even when we haven't used the word queer or gay or bisexual or trans, people like us have had certain traits associated with us, and you have to draw with really broad brushstrokes here. The average gay person is probably like an accountant. I don't know. I'm not saying like all queer people are creative storytellers and rebels and politically active. Not at all. We're every kind of person you can imagine. But simply by being different in these ways, in terms of your gender or sexuality, it has certain impacts on you. And I've had these 5 ways that people might be different. So, for example, when you're born, you know, you discover that you're gay or bisexual, asexual or trans, on some level, it makes you a kind of in-between person, because all the categories around you, man, woman, husband, wife, this is what men do, this is what women do, don't fit. They just don't fit. So you have to create new ones. You have to live outside in between. And society finds people that don't fit categories quite uncomfortable. It's how the human brain works, sadly. And so when you see a creature that is half fish, half human, or half horse, half human, or travels between worlds, or exists on another plane, you're going to see some symbolism and then go, that feels a little bit like me. That's something I can connect with, right? And so no wonder, when Hans Christian Andersen was like, right, what creature am I going to use to describe my heartbreak at being rejected by a man who can never understand how I feel and exists in another world? Well, a mermaid, right? Because she is a beautiful, sweet soul. She's delicate, but she lives in the sea and she's never going to be able to be up there. It's completely forbidden love. And she has a fishtail, so she's not quite human, right? And he even writes, mermaids can't cry. She literally cannot physically cry. So yeah, these are the symbols we draw upon. And there are many other reasons, but it's about kind of saying almost, rather than aren't we weird, aren't we broken, we're strange, so we like strange things. It's more like, look at these powers that we have, because these perspectives give us unique abilities to create and connect. There's a reason why people love the stories of Oscar Wilde. When Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein's monster is interesting because he's not just a big shambling monster. He has feelings. He wants to be human. He rebels against his creator. That's what makes it interesting. If it was literally just raw, boring. Absolute, no one would be setting that for GCSE literature writing, right? Because it would be dull. So queer people, we have this ability to see and create stories that don't just resonate with queer people, that resonate with everyone. So rather than seeing our deviance as wrong and broken, it's about seeing that we have these qualities, actually, these 5 magic beans that might help us to become so woven into folklore.
I love it. I really very much connected with the Between people and the Story Weavers. And I think it really satisfies for me. It's a beautiful way to end the book because as I said in the beginning of this chat, I'm always really interested in the sort of inner workings behind something and where does it come from? And it feels like it really, really beautifully ties it together, but also kind of has a, hey, this might be, some of this might be you in a way, and this is why you belong. So yeah, it's really beautiful. In the book, Sacha writes, for the most part, these are stories of people just getting on with their lives, showing remarkable resilience, wit, creativity, and joy in places that might seem otherwise unforgiving. It is a deeply human story, despite focusing largely on inhuman monsters. Well, okay. We're out of time, so we're going to do one more thing, though, with our last 5 minutes that I think would be really fun, which is, okay, so you do escape rooms, and I was thinking about this, and we like to do stuff that is a little bit more active, a little more interactive here on The Big Smoke, so we thought it'd be fun if, in order for me to escape this interview, not that I want to, because I'm having a lovely time, you would give me a little quiz and see how I do, and if you're listening along at home, you can play along as well. So what do you have for me?
So we were talking a bit about language. So historically, we were talking about codes earlier. Queer people have had to hide themselves. And one of the ways they've done this is by using coded or secret language. So I've kind of gone through and found 5 examples of words or phrases that aren't used today, or at least aren't popularly used today. And I want to see if you can guess what they might mean. These were used by queer people. A couple of them are from the gay language, Polari. So there was an entire language used by queer people to secretly communicate, but a few of them come from all over the place. So,
and by the way, when was Polari created? Do you know?
Oh, so it's
because I'd never heard of it until you told me about it.
It's a confluence of a lot of things. It's a mix of Yiddish and Romani and theatre speak and
oh wow, okay,
yeah, and it's mixed in with Cockney rhyming slang. It's a whole thing. So arguably, oh God, Dr. Baker, who actually studied this, is going to kill me. Probably around the 1700s, but it's evolved over time.
It's evolved over time, yeah.
But as a great example, I did a queer tour of Dulwich Picture Gallery a couple of days ago, and one of the guys on the tour, older guy, probably about in his 70s, came up to me and told me about his first experience going into a gay bar, and he sat down next to someone and they were talking in Polari, and he had no idea.
Oh my gosh!
Yeah, so it's
Okay, well, let's see how I do.
Okay.
I'm afraid I'm not going to be allowed out of here because I don't know how I'll do.
So the first one isn't Polari.
Okay.
This is probably more 1700s going on to the 19th century. Tuzzy Muzzy.
Tuzzy Muzzy.
Tuzzy Muzzy.
Is there any hints? Is it an action? Is it a noun?
Okay. A version of this was used by Mary Shelley in a letter that she wrote about another woman.
Ooh, gosh, is it some sort of sex act?
Close.
A tuzzy muzzy? It feels
Yes.
a little bit like it might be a dirty little something. Is it a dildo?
No, but it's something you might have use of with a dildo, perhaps.
Is it your vagina?
It is your vagina. Yeah. Tuzzy muzzy.
That is the term for a vagina. Okay, vagina.
Tuzzy muzzy. So she used the version. She said
That was close. I mean, you gave me a hint, but
she said she felt tousy mousy for another woman, which was a reference to the phrase tuzzy muzzy, which meant vagina. So basically, she was feeling a certain way.
Well, kudos to you if you got that one at home. Let's try another one.
Okay.
Let's see how I do. I feel like I didn't get it, but I was close.
You were good. Some of these got a vibe to it. This one's tricky.
Muzzy.
This is a Polari.
Okay, so this is Polari.
Omi Poloni.
Oni Poloni? Omi
Poloni.
Poloni. Is it an action?
No, it's a kind of person.
Oh, a kind of person.
Yeah.
Give me one more hint.
If you were to go to heaven on a night out, you'd see a fair few of these.
Is it just like a very camp person? A very kind of extravagant and out there and
correct
over the top? Okay.
It's a feminine man or a gay man.
Okay.
But it's specifically a feminine man.
Okay.
Right?
Oh, I was scared to guess that, but I got it right.
No, you did good. This is fun. This is another Polari one, and it's describing a kind of person. All right. This is a Ria Juja.
A kind of person, a Ria Juja.
A Ria Juja. Now, here's the fun. It's two words. The first word is Ria or Raya. You could pronounce it. And the last one is Juja. And we still use the word Juj today.
Ooh, yeah, Juj. But what does that mean?
Okay. All right.
No. I'm going to try to guess. Aria Juj. Okay. Someone with pizzazz?
Okay.
That's kind of what I guess for the last one. Because my first impulse was actually going to be someone that's kind of like a tight ass in a way, like a little bit more the opposite of Omi Poloni.
Omi Poloni. I'm going to give you a clue.
Give me a
clue.
clue.
First word is spelled Riah. Ria.
R-I-A-H.
And there's a really big clue there. If you do something to that word, you'll get what it means. Ria.
Oh my God, this is where my...
Flip it round the other way. Riah. I'm proper escaping.
Hair.
Hair. So a hair zhuzha.
Oh, it's just got to be like something like that you've put a lot of hairspray in your hair and done something to it, or like a perm or a...
Well, it's just a hairdresser.
A hairdresser!
It's a Ria zhuzha. Because they zhuzh your hair.
They zhuzh your hair. They zhuzh it
so
up.
this is like what Polari is. It's words flip back and forth. It's all kinds. All right.
Okay.
One more?
Let's do one more.
Okay, we'll do tribade.
I mean, it sounds like trident.
Yeah.
But give me a clue.
So it comes from the Greek word, which means to rub together.
Oh, is it...
Tribadis.
Say that again?
Tribadis.
Oh.
But it's tribade or
to rub together.
Tribad. Yeah, to rub together.
Is this one a sex act?
No, it's a kind of person.
Oh, a kind of person.
Imagine a heterosexual man trying to understand how a certain kind of person would have fun because they have a very poor understanding of it.
Oh my gosh. And it's an action?
It's a person.
Oh, it's a person.
You could be a tribad.
Oh, just like an ignorant kind of...
So I'm going to go for, what is it if I said scissoring?
Yes, well, that's what I was thinking when you were talking about rubbing together, but the type of person.
Yeah.
That thinks of that.
No, the kind of person that would be being described.
And when we're talking about...
Who would scissor? Who would we are if you knew
a
nothing?
lesbian.
Right.
Oh, I was thinking of the man who's trying to describe what that is. So, it's what is it again? A
tribade or tribad.
Oh, tribade or tribad.
So basically what they were like, we can't imagine what these women would do with each other, so they must just rub against each other. So that's the only understanding. They argued that they had like abnormally large clitorises. Yeah.
Well, you know what? If there's any way to end a Big Smoke interview, it's on abnormally large clitorises. So thank you so much.
You're
Sacha
welcome.
Coward,
Thank
for being
you.
here.
Thanks
Your
so much
book
for having
is
me.
Queer as Folklore. Check it out wherever you buy books. And also, is there a place for them to find you? Instagram, website?
Yeah. So it's Sacha, that's Sacha, and Coward, like the Cowardly Lion. I'm on Twitter, I know, Blue Sky, Instagram. I speak a lot of nonsense, but yeah, occasionally I say something clever, but mostly it's nonsense.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on The Big Smoke.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
When the bells ring out across the Big Smoke, we like to hear how you are fostering connection and community. We call this a Parish Notice. This week, we're looking beyond our doorsteps to see how pride shines, struggles, and survives in communities all around the globe. It's easy to forget just how recent some milestones really are. It was only in 1990 that the World Health Organization finally stopped classifying homosexuality as a mental disorder. And it wasn't until 2001 that any country in the world, the Netherlands being the first, legalized same-sex marriage. Just 24 years ago, there wasn't a single nation where queer families could be legally recognized. Today, marriage equality is law in 38 countries, but more than 60 still criminalize same-sex relationships, covering about 1 in 5 people worldwide. In 7 countries, being gay can still carry the death penalty. And yet, pride has always found a way, especially in the last decade or so, in places where simply showing up can feel like an act of pure courage. In 2013, in Kyiv, Ukraine, about 100 people marched in the city's first authorized pride parade, surrounded by more than 1,000 police officers to protect them from violent counter-protests. One marcher told The Guardian, "We came here to say that we exist." In 2017, in tiny East Timor, hundreds gathered for the country's first pride parade, cheered on by their prime minister, an act almost unimaginable just a few years earlier. In 2018, Eswatini, Africa's last absolute monarchy, saw its first Pride March. Despite threats from conservative leaders, hundreds took to the streets. It's not just a party, one activist told BBC Africa. It's a statement that we are here and we will not be silent. And in 2021 in Malawi, where consensual same-sex relationships can mean 14 years in prison, around 50 people marched in the country's first Pride, many wearing face masks to hide from being photographed. This year brought fresh reminders that Pride is equal parts celebration and resistance. In January, Thailand became the first Southeast Asian country to legalize same-sex marriage. Over 1,800 couples wed on day one, in district offices, on rooftops, even in shopping malls draped in rainbow flags. In Budapest, Pride turned into protest when thousands took to the streets despite a government ban. EU politicians marched alongside Hungarian activists to stand against Viktor Orban's harsh anti-LGBTQ+ laws. And according to The Guardian, only a few months ago, several LGBTQ+ Australians cancelled trips to World Pride in Washington, D.C., worried about the new U.S. border policies and the, quote, very real possibility of being detained, just for being who they are. Through all this, Pride still connects people. It can be a huge, joyful festival in the streets of Bangkok, a hush of rainbow flags in the streets of Budapest, or a quiet, trembling step in a country where you're told you don't exist at all. To read more about these stories, check out the links in our show notes. Reflecting on the myths and monsters from Queer as Folklore made me think of a true story that played on repeat in my mind when I was a teenager, coming to terms with my own sexuality. Matthew Shepard, a gay college student, was murdered in Laramie, Wyoming in 1998, when I was 10 years old. Shepard's murder was widely recognized as a hate crime motivated by his sexual orientation and became a symbol of violence against the LGBTQ+ community. I first learned about Matthew's story through the Laramie Project, a play and later a film created by the Tectonic Theater Project. The company went to Laramie, Wyoming just weeks after Matthew's murder and interviewed dozens of people from the town, friends, family, police officers, and witnesses. They turned those real words into a verbatim documentary play that tells the story through the voices of the community itself. That's why, at the end of the play, They included part of the actual court transcript. Matthew's father, Dennis Shepard, speaking directly to his son's killer. When I was a teenager, I performed this monologue more than anything else in my theater-fueled adolescence, though it couldn't have been less suitable casting. Me, a kid who'd never known real grief, trying to inhabit the emotions of a grieving father. But something about these words compelled me to speak them. Back then, I always felt I couldn't properly tell this story because I could never cry on stage. I think I knew deep down that if I really let go, if I fully stepped into the character, people might see who I really was. And maybe I'd be the next Matthew Shepard. So instead, I just repeated the words over and over. At auditions, in drama class, anywhere that required the presentation of a dramatic piece, this was the one I chose. And the more you metaphorically bang the drum, the more the ritual of words repeat and echo out into the world, the more we're moved and changed. In my final year of high school, I transferred to a school in Vancouver's inner city known for its arts program, a place that welcomed kids who couldn't afford expensive training but needed somewhere to belong. While she was researching how to build her own arts and music school, internationally renowned singer Sarah McLachlan heard about us. Whispers moved through the hallways that she was going to visit to learn more about our program. So our drama teacher put together a showcase. Scenes, music, mask pieces, and short films. My task? Perform a solo dramatic speech to end the performance. No pressure. But I knew exactly which piece I would choose. The monologue about Matthew Shepard. I'll never forget standing there in our little theater studio. There were these windows high on the back wall that let in the natural daylight. Listen for the reference to the wind in this piece, because when I spoke those words, I distinctly remember in that exact moment an actual huge gust of wind blowing hard against those windows, rattling them, sending shivers down my spine. I get shivers now just thinking about it. And just like Dennis Shepard says about his son Matthew, I felt like I wasn't alone when I spoke those words that day. To set up the speech, you should know that after Aaron McKinney was found guilty of murdering Matthew Shepard, he agreed to a plea deal to avoid the death penalty. The Shepards chose to accept the deal, asking for 2 consecutive life sentences instead. Under Wyoming law, the victim's family is allowed to speak before sentencing. This is part of what Matthew's father, Dennis Shepard, said to the court, words that were included at the end of the Laramie Project. Dennis Shepard. My son Matthew did not look like a winner. He was rather uncoordinated and wore braces from the age of 13 until the day he died. However, in his all too brief life, he proved that he was a winner. On October 6, 1998, my son tried to show the world that he could win again. On October 12, 1998, my firstborn son and my hero lost. On October 12, 1998, my firstborn son and my hero died, 50 days before his 22nd birthday. I keep wondering the same thing that I did when I first saw him in the hospital. What would he have become? How could he have changed his piece of the world to make it better? Matt officially died in a hospital in Fort Collins, Colorado. He actually died on the outskirts of Laramie, tied to a fence. You, Mr. McKinney, with your friend Mr. Henderson, left him out there by himself. But he wasn't alone. There were his lifelong friends with him. Friends that he had grown up with. You're probably wondering who these friends were. First, he had the beautiful night sky, and the same stars and moon that we used to see through a telescope. Then he had the daylight and the sun to shine on him. And through it all, he was breathing in the scent of pine trees from the snowy range. He heard the wind, the ever-present Wyoming wind, for the last time. He had one more friend with him. He had God. And I feel better knowing he wasn't alone. Matt's beating hospitalization, and funeral focused worldwide attention on hate. Good is coming out of evil. People have said enough is enough. I miss my son, but I am proud to be able to say that he is my son. Judy has been quoted as being against the death penalty. It has been stated that Matt was against the death penalty. Both of these statements are wrong. Matt believed that there were crimes and incidents that justified the death penalty. I too believe in the death penalty. I would like nothing better than to see you die, Mr. McKinney. However, this is the time to begin the healing process. To show mercy to someone who refused to show any mercy. Mr. McKinney, I'm going to grant you life, as hard as it is for me to do so because of Matthew. Every time you celebrate Christmas, a birthday, the 4th of July, remember that Matt isn't. Every time you wake up in your prison cell, remember that you had the opportunity and the ability to stop your actions that night. You robbed me of something very precious, and I will never forgive you for that. Mr. McKinney, I give you life in the memory of one who no longer lives. May you have a long life, and may you thank Matthew every day for it. The next day, after the showcase, I was hanging around in the drama studio, as I always did, whether I had class or not, and my teacher got a phone call. There was something waiting in the office. Walk with me, he said. We can chat more about yesterday's performance. So we wandered down the hallway together, talking about what it meant to stand there and speak those words out loud, and how kind Sarah seemed as she sat there, smiling, eyes glowing, while receiving our performances. But when we arrived at the office, there was no package waiting for us. The secretary looked up and said, "You'll want to go outside? It's at the front door." When we stepped outside, we saw a huge delivery truck parked by the curb. And being unloaded was the most beautiful new piano I had ever seen. Shiny, black, shimmering. On it was a note from Sarah McLachlan saying how moved she had been from our performances, and that this was a small token of her gratitude for sharing our hearts and souls with her. That moment felt like another whisper, just like that gust of wind. A whisper that I was not alone, an acknowledgement that the words I repeated about Matthew Shepard would continue to echo and never be forgotten. In the heart of Londinium, Lugdenham, London town, let's just call it the Big Smoke, is our River Thames. It is the living, breathing artery of our city, rising and falling every day with the tide. Because it is uniquely a tidal river, there are a group of licensed historians called Mudlarks who bring themselves to the foreshore every day and with only the naked eye help uncover the history of London in an effort to learn about the everyday people who have inhabited our corner of the world. So, it's time for us to venture down to the river and visit with Sean Clark the Mudlark to find out what has found him lately.
Hello Big Smoke listeners, it's Sean Clark down here at the Thames foreshore, and I wanted to tell you about a special object that found me very recently. But before we get going, let me tell you a bit about myself. I stumbled upon mudlarking in 2020 after my beautiful wife Trudy passed away. The peacefulness of the foreshore and the magic of the River Thames giving up its secrets on every tide is quite spiritual to me. I like to say that the artefacts find me rather than the other way round. Bone dice, beads, pilgrim badges and coins are some of the treasures that I've added to my collection of foreshore finds.
So, what do you have for us today, Sean Clark?
Today's find is a James I copper Harrington type farthing, which would have been made between 1614 and 1616. Nestled between a medieval roof tile fragment and some really old oyster shells, glistening in the sunshine, was this beautiful James I coin. The majority of the coin is completely pristine, bright copper colour, as it would have been and looked over 400 years ago when it was minted. There is, however, a very small part of the coin that is black. This tells me that the coin had been encased in the black anaerobic mud on the banks of the River Thames. Because the mud is aerobic and has no oxygen in it, it preserves all the artefacts. The small black area of the coin would have been exposed to the river. I believe that one of the clipper boat's propellers had disturbed the riverbed, releasing the coin from its slumber, and a wave from the wake of the boat has thrown it onto the foreshore just shortly before it found me. This coin is quite special, as it was our country's first copper coin, made under licence by Lord Harrington. Naturally, James got a cut of the profits. Originally the deal was 50-50, but when James worked out it was a money spinner, he changed that to 60-40 in his favour. Normally the coins would be made out of silver or gold, because the value of the coin was always the value of the metal. These copper coins, however, have no real intrinsic value. Interestingly, during the reign of Charles I, the colony of Massachusetts in the New World requested a supply of these copper farthings so they could be used as small change. These coins were not forthcoming, so they passed a law allowing people to use musket balls as small change. The value of the musket ball was fixed at a farthing, and the maximum amount of musket balls you could use in any one transaction was 12 pence, or 48 musket balls.
Wow.
You could say more bang for your buck.
Have you ever found a musket ball?
I've got a big collection of musket balls, which I now consider as coins.
Wow, I love that. Well, I will say this coin is very thin. Makes me feel like I'm holding a piece of, I don't know, tinfoil or something like that. Like I'm afraid it could so easily break. So it's amazing that it is still fully intact. Another window into history from Sean Clark the Mudlark. You can see an image of today's find if you follow us on Instagram at The Big Smoke Variety, or sign up to our newsletter at thebigsmokevariety.com. Well, that's our show. Whether today got you thinking about the myths that shape us, the real stories that refuse to stay buried, or the whispers that remind us we're not alone, we're glad you were here. If you liked what you heard, share this episode with a friend, or leave us a quick review on your podcast app of choice. It really helps us grow and welcome more people into our little parish here. Until next time, friends, take care of each other, and we'll see you soon in the Big Smoke.